saw the clip. Kennedy Carter shoves Caitlin Clark, the replay spreads everywhere, and within minutes people start talking like they had just watched a career end in real time. But that's not really why this story hit so hard. What made it explode was the timing. This didn't happen in some quiet stretch of the season with half the basketball world barely paying attention. It happened at the exact moment the WNBA was sitting under a brighter spotlight than it had seen in years, and whether people like it or not, Caitlin Clark was right at the center of that shift. That same framing drives your competitor transcript too, where the story is built around the idea that the league had changed fast, the cameras were bigger, the audience was bigger, and one moment suddenly meant more than it would have before. That's the part a lot of people miss. Clark didn't just arrive as another rookie with hype. She came in carrying a level of attention that changed the temperature of every game she played. More viewers, more debate, more people watching who normally wouldn't even be talking about the WNBA. And when one player brings that much interest, every hard foul, every stare, every sideline reaction gets pulled apart in a way it normally wouldn't. Fair or unfair, that's what happens when the audience gets bigger. Suddenly, a single moment stops belonging just to the court. It becomes a national conversation. And that's where the pressure starts building. Because for the players already in the league, this wasn't just about defending one rookie. It was about dealing with what came with her. The cameras were following everything. Fans were reacting to everything. Every possession had more heat on it. And when that kind of attention gets dropped into a league that has been fighting for respect for years, emotions can get complicated fast. Some people saw opportunity. Some saw disruption. Some probably felt both at the same time. That's what made this game feel different before the shove ever happened. Indiana wasn't just playing Chicago. It felt like the whole atmosphere around the league had changed, and everyone on the floor knew it. Clark was doing what she had already become known for doing, controlling pace, stretching the defense, making passes that looked impossible until they landed right where they were supposed to. The more comfortable she looked, the more uncomfortable everything around her seemed to become. You could almost feel the irritation building possession by possession. And that's why people were so locked in when the moment finally came. Not because basketball has never seen hard contact before. It has. Not because tempers have never boiled over. They have. But because this felt like something bigger had been sitting under the surface the whole time. The clip gave people a single frame to attach all their opinions to. About Clark. About jealousy. About fame. About the league changing too fast. About who was handling that change well and who clearly wasn't. That's what turned one play into a full-blown talking point. The shove was the spark, but the ground was already dry. And once people sensed that, they stopped asking whether the moment was ugly and started asking what it revealed. When the shove actually happened, what made it so jarring was how little ambiguity there was. Sometimes a foul looks worse in slow motion than it did live. Sometimes players get tangled up, tempers flare, bodies move fast, and people spend the next 2 days arguing over intent. This didn't feel like that. Even in real time, it looked wrong. And once the replays started looping, it looked even worse. Your competitor's transcript leans hard on that exact angle too, repeating that there was no basketball reason for it, no play on the ball, no real excuse to hide behind. That's why the reaction felt different from a normal controversy. Fans weren't split in the usual way where one side says it was dirty and the other says people are overreacting. A lot of people looked at that clip and had the same immediate response. What was that? It wasn't just the force of it. It was the choice. Carter walks up, Clark isn't bracing for contact, and then suddenly she's on the floor. It had that rare quality where the more you watched it, the less defensible it became. And once that happens, the crowd isn't just reacting to the foul anymore. They're reacting to what it seems to say. That's what made the arena feel strange. It wasn't the loud, chaotic kind of outrage that usually follows a flagrant play. It was more like a moment of disbelief. Like everyone needed a second to process whether what they thought they saw had actually just happened. That kind of silence says a lot. It means people didn't see a hard basketball play. They saw something that felt personal. What made it hit even harder was Clark's response. She got up. No scene. No dramatic escalation. No performance for the cameras. She just kept going. And that contrast matters, because in moments like this, people instantly start measuring both sides against each other. One player creates the chaos, the other absorbs it and moves on. One looks emotional, the other looks composed. Whether that's always fair is a different question, but that's how public opinion works. It forms fast, and once it locks in, it's hard to undo. That's really where the story started getting away from Carter. Because the clip by itself was already damaging. But paired with Clark staying calm, it became even more brutal optically. Now it wasn't just about an ugly shove. It was about image. About poise. About who looked in control and who didn't. In a league already dealing with non-stop attention, that kind of contrast spreads faster than any official explanation ever could. And the internet did what it always does. It took one moment and blew it into a symbol. Not just of a rivalry. Not just of a bad decision. But of something deeper people were already looking for. Some framed it as resentment toward Clark's spotlight. Some framed it as frustration boiling over. Some framed it as proof that the league had a bigger culture problem. Once people start attaching that many meanings to one clip, the actual play is no longer just a play. It becomes evidence for whatever story they already wanted to tell. That's when the real danger starts. Because at that point, it's not enough for the player involved to just move on and hope people forget. The moment has become bigger than the game itself. And once that happens, the next words out of your mouth matter almost as much as the play. A lot of careers don't start falling apart because of the mistake. They start falling apart because of what happens right after it. That's the part people underestimate. Fans, media, even leagues will forgive a bad moment faster than they'll forgive the feeling that someone learned nothing from it. And in this case, that's where everything got even messier. In the transcript you shared, the competitor builds a huge part of the story around Carter's post-game response, treating it like the moment that confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. 'Cause think about it. After a clip like that, the bar for damage control is actually pretty low. You do not need some perfect speech. You do not need tears. You do not need a 10-minute apology tour. Most people just want a sign that you get it. Something simple. Something human. Even a short, "I was frustrated, I crossed the line, that's on me," can cool a situation down more than people realize. It doesn't erase the play, but it changes the energy around it. It gives people a reason to believe the moment was emotional, not revealing. But when that doesn't happen, the opposite effect kicks in fast. Now people stop focusing on the act and start focusing on the mindset behind it. They start wondering whether the shove was just a lapse, or whether it exposed something deeper about how that player handles pressure, criticism, and attention. And that shift is brutal, because it turns one ugly highlight into a character debate. That's what made the aftermath so important. The feeling people got was not just that Carter made a bad decision in the heat of the moment. It was that she didn't seem interested in meeting the moment with much reflection afterward. And once people sense that, they become much less generous. The public can be harsh, but it's also predictable. It often gives athletes one obvious escape route. Own it quickly. The second that route gets ignored, the tone changes. Suddenly, the conversation gets colder. Analysts stop saying, "bad foul," and start saying, "pattern." Commentators stop discussing the game and start dissecting attitude. Viewers start replaying not only what happened on the court, but the body language after it, the quotes after it, the lack of visible regret after it. That's when a controversy stops feeling temporary. It starts to stick. And that's really the turning point in stories like this. Not the hit itself, but the feeling left behind after the explanation. Because once people decide you don't fully understand why they're upset, they begin to revisit everything else with sharper eyes. Old moments look worse. Criticism gets louder. Doubt spreads faster. What might have stayed a rough incident suddenly starts looking like confirmation. That's how one mistake grows teeth. Not just because it happened, but because the response gave the story room to expand. And once that door opened, people didn't just stay focused on Indiana anymore. They started looking backward. Once people start looking backward, the story changes completely. It stops being about one night, one foul, one bad decision. Now it becomes a search for signs. People start asking whether this was really out of character, or whether it was the moment everything people had been whispering about finally became visible to everybody else. That's exactly how your competitor transcript stretches the narrative, by moving from the shove itself into the idea that this was just the latest chapter in a longer pattern. And to be fair, that's how public opinion usually works in sports. The moment an athlete ends up at the center of a viral controversy, nobody keeps the conversation limited to that one incident. Fans start pulling up older clips, older reports, old team exits, old locker room talk, old rumors about chemistry and attitude. Some of it is fair. Some of it gets exaggerated. Some of it gets flattened into a simpler story than reality probably deserves. But once that process starts, it is incredibly hard to stop. That's what made this situation feel more dangerous than a normal on-court flare-up. Carter wasn't being viewed in a vacuum. People were immediately connecting the clip to prior stops in her career, prior tensions, prior questions about fit. And once viewers feel like they can draw a line through separate incidents, they become convinced they're not watching randomness anymore. They believe they're watching the truth finally reveal itself. That doesn't mean every claim people throw around should be treated like proven fact. It shouldn't. One of the biggest mistakes channels make in scripts like this is taking every rumor, every anonymous quote, every social media theory, and presenting it like courtroom evidence. That makes the story louder, but not smarter. The stronger version is to focus on perception, because perception is what actually drives these situations. It's not always about what every team said publicly. It's about what fans and media believed those past moments now meant when placed next to the shove. And the perception was brutal. Instead of seeing the Indiana incident as a one-off meltdown, people started seeing it as the latest proof that talent was never the issue. That's what makes stories like this hit so hard. Nobody was questioning whether Carter could play. Nobody was debating whether she had the physical tools. The tension was somewhere else. It was about whether high-level ability can keep carrying someone once questions about judgment, discipline, and fit start stacking up. That's a much darker storyline, because it feels more final. A bad foul can be survived. A bad reputation is harder to shake. Especially when the public starts treating every old headline like part of one long file that was always waiting to be opened. At that point, the discussion moves away from basketball skill and into something much more personal. Not who is more talented, but who organizations feel they can trust when the pressure gets high. And once that trust becomes the real issue, people begin noticing something else that can be even louder than criticism. Silence. Silence can be louder than a statement, especially in sports. When a player gets dragged online, teammates usually give something. Maybe not a full defense, maybe not a big emotional speech, but something. A quote, a post, a vague show of support. Even a small public gesture can signal that whatever happened on the court, the locker room is still standing behind that person. That's why the silence around this situation got so much attention. Your competitor transcript makes that one of its strongest emotional beats too, framing the absence of public support like its own kind of message. And honestly, that's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because people can debate the shove. They can debate intent. They can debate whether the reaction online was too much. But when the people closest to the situation do not rush in publicly, fans notice. They always notice. Then they start filling in the blanks themselves. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe there are private conversations nobody sees. Maybe support was handled behind the scenes. But public silence has a way of creating its own story whether that story is accurate or not. That's what made the atmosphere around Carter feel even colder. People weren't just reacting to the clip anymore. They were reacting to what looked like distance. And distance, in a moment like that, gets interpreted fast. It gets read as frustration, as exhaustion, as people having already seen enough. The second viewers feel like teammates are not eager to jump in. They assume the problem is bigger than one incident. Then social media makes it even more intense. Because now every follow, unfollow, missing photo, awkward interaction, and absent comment gets treated like a clue. A normal person could look at that and say maybe it means nothing. The internet never says that. The internet turns every small digital movement into evidence. And once a player is already under fire, those tiny signals start feeling massive. Not because they prove everything, but because they seem to fit the mood people already have. That's why this phase of the story becomes so hard to control. The player is no longer only fighting the original controversy. Now they're fighting the interpretation of everybody else's behavior around it. If teammates don't speak, that becomes a headline. If friends seem distant, that becomes a headline. If nobody publicly softens the moment, the silence starts acting like confirmation in people's minds, even if nobody ever actually says the words out loud. And that may be the most brutal part of all. Public backlash is one thing. But the feeling that the room itself may have already been drifting away? That hits differently. Because fans can be wrong. Comment sections can be chaotic. But when people think they're spotting emotional distance from inside the team, they take it seriously. They assume those players know more than they do. So the conversation stopped being just about what Carter did. It became about what the lack of visible support seemed to say. And once a story reaches that point, it becomes almost impossible to contain. Because now the public isn't only watching the player. They're watching everyone around the player too. What made all of this even more unforgiving was the timing. Not just game timing but league timing. This happened during a stretch when the WNBA was getting more attention, more scrutiny, and frankly more outside judgment than it had seen in a very long time. That matters, because leagues do not react to incidents in a vacuum. They react inside the moment they are living in. And the moment the WNBA was living in made everything feel bigger. Your competitor transcript pushes that angle over and over, tying the controversy to the league's growth, its rising visibility, and the idea that the standards were suddenly becoming much more public. That is why a lot of people who looked at this as just one hard foul missed the bigger picture. The league was already under a microscope. Caitlin Clark's arrival had pulled in casual viewers, mainstream debate, non-stop sports coverage, and a wave of new opinions from people who had not been invested before. That kind of sudden growth sounds great on paper, but it also creates tension. Because now every incident is no longer being judged only by longtime fans or insiders who understand the rhythms of the league. It is being judged by millions of newer viewers who are seeing everything in the most amplified possible way. And leagues know that. They know when they are being introduced to a bigger audience. They know when narratives are forming in real time. They know when clips are traveling far beyond the normal sports cycle. So when something ugly happens in that environment, it carries a different kind of weight. Not necessarily because the play itself is unprecedented, but because the image of it becomes dangerous. It can shape how outsiders talk about the league, how media packages the league, how sponsors view the league, and how future controversies get framed. That is why this moment felt like more than player versus player. It felt like a collision between personal frustration and institutional pressure. Carter was dealing with whatever was happening in her own head, in that own game, in that own moment. But the league was dealing with something else entirely. It was dealing with growth, branding, attention, reputation, and the question of what kind of image it wanted attached to this new era. Those are not small things. And when an incident lands at the intersection of all that, it stops being handled like an isolated outburst. That is also why public opinion hardened so fast. People weren't just reacting emotionally to Clark getting shoved. They were reacting to what the clip represented in a bigger cultural moment. For some, it looked like resentment toward the player bringing in a new audience. For others, it looked like proof that the league was struggling to manage the spotlight. For others, it became another excuse to start arguments that had been building for months. The details shifted depending on who was talking, but the result was the same. The shove was no longer a moment. It had become a symbol. And symbols are dangerous because they no longer belong to the people involved. Once a clip becomes symbolic, everyone starts using it to prove whatever they already believed. That is when the player at the center of it loses control of the story. No explanation is enough. No clarification is enough. The moment now means too many things to too many people. It spreads beyond basketball and into something messier. Image, politics, media narratives, fan tribalism, even questions about who the future of the sport is supposed to belong to. That is why the timing made this so brutal. In another season, maybe it is still ugly but shorter-lived. In this season, with this audience, with this spotlight, with Clark in the middle of it, it became something much heavier. And once that happens, the fallout stops being about one game. It starts becoming about what one moment could cost going forward. This is the part people usually talk about too late. Not the clip. Not the outrage. Not the hot takes. The cost. Because when a moment like this blows up, the damage does not stay inside one game or 1 week of headlines. It follows the player. It changes how people talk about them, how organizations view them, and how much grace they get the next time anything goes wrong. Your competitor transcript leans heavily into that idea too, turning the story into a warning about how talent alone cannot protect a career once reputation starts taking real hits. And that is the harsh truth about modern sports. A player can recover from a bad night. They can recover from a slump. They can even recover from controversy sometimes. What is much harder to recover from is becoming easy to label. Once the public decides you are that kind of player, every future moment gets filtered through that lens. Normal frustration looks worse. Small incidents feel bigger. Neutral decisions by teams or media suddenly get interpreted as part of the same old story. It becomes harder and harder to exist as a full person because your name starts triggering one ready-made narrative. That is where the real long-term cost sits. Not only in contracts or brand deals or public image, though those matter. It is in trust. Trust from coaches. Trust from front offices. Trust from teammates. Trust from fans who might otherwise have been willing to move on. High-level sports are filled with talented players. What separates who gets endless chances and who doesn't is often not ability. It is whether the people in power believe the risk is worth living with. Once that calculation turns against you, everything gets more fragile. And the scary part is how quickly that shift can happen. One moment gets clipped. One reaction goes viral. One press conference quote lands badly. Then the conversation changes from, "Can this player help us win?" to, "Can we afford the noise that comes with this player?" That is a brutal question, because it has very little to do with box scores. It is about emotional math. About public relations. About locker room stability. About whether people think the problem is temporary or built in. That is why this kind of controversy sticks. Not because everyone suddenly forgets the player's talent, but because they start weighing the talent against everything else. And once that happens, the burden shifts. Now the player is not just asked to perform well. They are expected to prove they are not the version of themselves the public has already decided on. That is a much harder fight than most fans realize. You are not just competing against opponents anymore. You are competing against a story. And stories, once they harden, can cost more than money. They can cost momentum. They can cost reputation. They can cost the benefit of the doubt. In some cases, that is the biggest loss of all, because the benefit of the doubt is what keeps a career flexible. It is what lets people say, "That was bad, but let's not overreact." The second that disappears, every mistake feels heavier. If you've made it this far, subscribe, because this is exactly where these stories get more interesting, not less. The clip is what everyone watches. The fallout is what actually tells you who's in trouble. In the end, that is why this story stayed with people. It was never just about a shove, even though the shove is what everyone remembers first. It became bigger because it landed in the middle of a league changing fast, a rookie drawing historic attention, a player already carrying questions, and a response that made the whole thing feel harder to explain away. That is what turns a single sports moment into something people keep talking about long after the final buzzer. And honestly, that is what makes this story uncomfortable. Because talent was never really the mystery here. The ability was obvious. The explosiveness was obvious. The potential was obvious. What people ended up debating was something much harder to measure and much harder to fix once public trust starts slipping. Judgment. Composure. Self-awareness. The things nobody gets excited about on draft night, but the same things that quietly decide who lasts and who keeps drifting into the same storm. That is also why these moments hit so hard with fans. People are not just watching basketball when something like this happens. They are watching pressure-exposed character in real time. They are watching how someone reacts when frustration boils over, when the spotlight gets hotter, when the easy excuse is right there, and when the whole sports world is waiting to see what comes next. Some players calm the fire. Some players feed it. And once that difference becomes visible, people do not forget it. So no, this was not just one ugly play. It felt like a snapshot of something bigger. A collision between pressure and perception, talent and trust, opportunity and self-sabotage. And the reason it keeps pulling people back in is because deep down, everyone knows careers usually do not fall apart all at once. They crack in pieces. Quietly at first. Then publicly. Then all at once. It feels obvious in hindsight. That may be the real lesson here. Not that one mistake defines a person forever, but that repeated moments, poor timing, and the wrong response can make one mistake feel like the final proof of everything people were already starting to believe. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, comment with your take, and subscribe for more deep dive stories like this. Because the biggest